Right. Good evening or good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Erwin Arroyo Perez, and I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of the Poetry Lighthouse and a poet myself. It is an honor and a genuine joy to bring you all here today for Nature of Our Times Global Edition, Reading and Conversation. A huge thank you to everyone for being here. In a world that moves fast and speaks loudly, you chose to spend this time with poetry, which is something that really matters. So I want to start by asking a question that I believe it's worth sitting with for this conversation, and that is why eco-poetry and why now? Um, so as Jean Chocteau puts it, eco-poetry is nature poetry that has designs on us, that imagines changing the ways we think, feel about, and live and act in the world. So I'd now like to invite Aileen Cassinetto, Luisa Igloria, and David Hassler, to say a few words about the anthology, and which is at the heart of this event. So without further ado, I would like to start with Aileen, who will let us know a little bit more about the anthology and the mission of this book.
Hi, Erwin. First of all, thank you for generously holding this space. Um, I will let Luisa and David talk about the mission and the themes, but I just want to quickly say that what drew me to this project is I think there's something important about who gets to frame the state of nature. And if you don't see yourself in the story, it's very hard to feel that your response or your participation matters. So I just wanted to help build something, and plus it's an opportunity to work with Luisa and David again, and get to work with Phil Levin. And so I will pass it on to Luisa.
Hi, thank you also. Thank you, Erwin, and everybody for being here. Thank you to my co-editors and co-conspirators in this wonderful project. It is almost a year since the spring that we sat down together to talk about how we would pull poems together into this anthology with the idea of creating a work that would work alongside the erstwhile first National Nature Assessment, which was the work of Dr. Philip Levin. And what we did was to really try to invite folks to participate in a way that would be most meaningful to them in whatever space they were in. So this is a book which we envisioned to speak to not just people who normally, or typically already write or read poetry. We wanted to be as inclusive and inviting as possible. And so we also have, and maybe David can also talk about the other things related to the online gallery, which we have also decided to keep up and also invite continuing participation too. So we received more than 1,300 submissions, and we read every single one at least 3 times and came to our consideration of which would actually get into the book. We have 210 poets represented in the print anthology, and they are as wonderful and as diverse as we could possibly have hoped for. And we are just so happy that we were able to bring this into the world. And I'll let David take over from there.
Thank you, Luisa and Aileen, and thank you, Erwin, for creating this space for all of us. As both Aileen and Luisa have said, I think we were also excited about an opportunity to create this poetry anthology that would be an official companion to a scientific document, an assessment, a very comprehensive assessment. And the spirit of what is now called the Nature Record, and they have a beautiful website, thenaturerecord.org, and they have a draft of this voluminous assessment. They have been wanting for people to help tell the story, to respond to it, to give feedback, but also to capture the lived experience of individuals in different communities around the country, um, to their experience of nature. And so that poems, our vision was that our poetry anthology that's printed, but also the online growing gallery, which now has over 1,400 poems and can be sorted by topic or sorted by name. Poems and this poetic expression can come into the service of a deeper holistic understanding of the assessment and of our relationship to nature. It becomes another way of knowing, another way of doing science and connecting science to spirit and bridging that gap which has been exacerbated in recent modern times. So, um, it was a thrill for me. I'm grateful that Aileen and Luisa reached out and asked me to join their endeavor and to join this project, which they had already dreamed up with Dr. Phil Levin. We're not done because we envision using excerpts from the Nature Record assessment in a interactive exhibit where people can make a found poem by reading excerpts and tapping words and then rearranging them into a found their own creative reflection based on language in the assessment. And an exhibit that would then also have static banners of poems from the anthology. So we're really envisioning how this can travel to science centers actually around the country, to both amplify the work of the assessment and to bring poetry into a serious conversation, a serious play, with the public's awareness of the assessment. So we really want this dialogue, this back and forth between the voice of poetry and the voice of science, informing each other and amplifying each other. So I do want to make a plug. I met Aileen and Luisa because of the work I do alongside Jane Hirschfield and as my role at the Wick Poetry Center to build out a Poets for Science initiative that all began back in 2017. And we are bringing many people, scientists and poets, to Kent, Ohio for a Poets for Science gathering, November 12th, 13th, and 14th. Aileen and Luisa will be doing a session inspired by the work of the anthology. So I will put into the chat a link to that gathering. I encourage those of you who are interested to explore this. It's going to be maybe the first ever on a national level to bring scientists and poets together to cross-fertilize ideas, to meet, connect, and then inspire, and hopefully go forth and collaborate in new and innovative ways. So, anyway, just wanted to make that as a sort of announcement as we begin this reading today about the nature of our times. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aileen, Luisa, and David. I think that was very, very inspiring. I really liked, David, what you said about the lived experience, this assessment, and how you all managed to make it as inclusive and, sort of open to everyone as possible. As you said, it's a new way of doing science, and I think that's at the heart of this anthology. And for everyone who's watching, just make sure to check the experience of perhaps the upcoming gathering. Might be very interesting to, connect with other people and, both scientists and poets and have a broader perspective of the world we live in. I think it would be an amazing opportunity. So, well, that was great. Thank you so much for introducing the book. We'll now move into the readings. So each poet will read one poem from Nature of Our Times, or in the case of Pat Farrington, she will read from her collection Only One Earth. And after each reading, we'll ask one question just to open a brief conversation, and I'll leave my poem till the end because I don't want to take the center stage. So please correct me if I mispronounce any names. Feel because I tend to do that very, very often. So our first poet will be Yvonne Blomer. So Yvonne Blomer's sixth book is Death of Persephone, a murder, a mystery in poems based on the Persephone myth. She is a past poet laureate of Victoria and an award-winning poet and non-fiction writer who lives on the traditional territories of the, Lekwungen. I don't know if I pronounced that well.
Lekwungen.
Sorry, can you do it again?
Lekwungen.
Lekwungen. Thank you so much. Speaking people. She has edited 3 poetry anthologies on climate change and water, most recently Sublime Poems for Vanishing Eyes. So today she's going to read her poem, Paper Gravity.
Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be here. I'm on the west coast of Canada, so I think we're an international crew here, and it's great to start things off. If you're reading along, my poem is on page 135, and can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, great. So the poem is called Paper Gravity. And it's after a poem by Danez Smith called Bear. If love is a forest, leave it alone. Let the wind, let time live in it for the thousands of years, the tiny organisms. If love is fire and fire breaks out, let love also be water and smoke and the wolf running and even the wolf's hope. Did you read of the bear, its paws burnt, and of the den logged? And did you read the child's story of the bear who cannot sleep and swims deep, climbs a mountain steep? If love is loss, then all is lost. The forest, the wolf, and the bear, and the child in his bed who dreams of running, but is held fast. The body is love, and it is rod and bone weight. And gravity is all, and it is grave, and it holds even the torn and folded, which is the child's paper plane, flung with such force through ash and cloud and sky, tumbling to what remains when the forest is gone. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was a brilliant poem. I loved hearing it for the first time, in the poet's voice. I loved how this poem holds love and ecological laws in the same breath, which is incredible. How you managed to do the forest and the wolf and all these aspects of nature and start questioning what would we do with these, with nature if we were to see it as a lover, pretty much, if we felt that connection towards nature, how would it feel like losing someone? If you lose a forest, would it feel like losing someone? I think that's a very interesting way of thinking about it. So I just have a quick question regarding this poem talks a lot about gravity and the weight of the world. So I wonder how love and grief can be part of this idea that not only scientifically speaking about gravity, how things fall, but also the metaphorical falling of life. How do you envision this unfolding of the unfolding of this metaphor?
I think I had read somewhere that if we had like 10% or even as little as 5% less gravity on Earth, nothing that we have would work the way it does. Like the water wouldn't stay in the oceans, like nothing would be as it is. So we have this perfect balance of things on planet Earth. So I think I was thinking of that, and I was thinking of that kind of the child throwing the paper plane, and the paper plane with that less gravity wouldn't work. And, fire everything would be so much different. And then I also had this children's story in my head about this bear who is kind of hard of hearing, so never hears the advice it gets about going to sleep properly, so does all these other mad things. And just thinking about how we often separate ourselves from the natural world, but if we were enfolded into the natural world as we enfold that bear into us in a way through its inability to hear properly, and thinking about every part of what we make and what's happening to the natural world right now is also a part of us, so that we're fully integrated. We are also part of the natural world is often something that I'm trying to convey. So I think, I'm not sure I'm being very clear, but I'm trying to capture all those kinds of ideas and images in the poem. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I really enjoyed the imagery here. It really speaks to me, and it feels so alive. It feels like it connects us somehow. And indeed, how lucky we are that we have the gravity that allows us to stay on 2 feet and be able to walk and be able to hold things. And it's something that it's
Yeah, I think
incredible.
thank you. I think our bone mass would be different as well, right? As we know from astronauts, when they go into space, they lose bone mass. So it was very trying to integrate everything happening to planet Earth, that we're part of that, and it's happening to us as well, which I think, we're all really aware of when fire season starts and all those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for
Thank
that.
you. Thanks.
Right. Well, that was amazing. A great start. So now we're going to move on to the next poet, which is Cassandra Bousquet. I don't know if your last name is pronounced that way. I'm very sorry. Correct me if I'm wrong. But Cassandra hails from Brisbane, California, and she was a writer in residence at a Linden Place, a historic mansion and museum in Bristol. In April 2023, she was the 2024 recipient of the inaugural Poetry Lighthouse Prize and received an honorable mention from her Ruth Weiss Foundation in their 2024 poetry contest. Her poem, Dear Human at the Edge of Time, appears in the 2023 anthology of the same title, edited by Luisa, Igloria, Aileen, Cassinetto, and Jeremias Hopman. And today, she is excited to celebrate the nature of our times, poems on America's lands, waters, wildlife, and other natural wonders, edited by Aileen, Luisa, and David. Her most recent publication is in Hippocampus, a collection of poetry and prose on what it means to be alive in 2026, an anthology she has published along with her graduating creative writing class. And today she's here to read Attack of the Storm King at the Theodora Court.
Thank you, Erwin. So I have just a short author's note that I think is important for the context of this poem. And this poem was written during my writer's residency at Linden Place, a historic mansion and museum in Bristol, Rhode Island, in April 2023. It was part of an unpublished collection of poems I wrote about the complicated history of the house, told through the perspective of the linden trees that line the property. Theodora Colt, referenced in this poem, is the woman responsible for renaming the house Linden Place, formerly DeWolf Mansion, and planting the linden trees in an attempt to begin a new chapter in spite of the slavery that defined the house and surrounding area of Bristol. Theodora was quite attached to the linden trees and a poet in her own right. This poem references a poem she wrote about a great storm that knocked many of the linden trees down. And I like to think of my poem as a symbol of resilience and hope amidst the literal and physical storms that threaten our planet. The nature of our times may be frightening, but like the linden trees, we stand tall, honoring the past and staunchly looking towards the future. So this is Attack of the Storm King after Theodora Cole. Imagine a cloud, seams ripping, water spilling. Imagine the sky, cold tears falling, eyes filling. Imagine a god wrapped tight in slivers of soul. Imagine your world, fast spinning out of control. Imagine a tree, a being you called your mother. Imagine an arm, a branch you called your brother. Imagine a chant, a loud orchestral uproar. Imagine the wind and her wild dance of gore. Defy the storm king, we rasped and shouted and cried. Defy the storm king, some trees sang out as they died. Ms. Colt wrung her hands. She sat head bowed in the dark. She let a tear fall. Beneath the sky, trees lay stark. Poor Theodora, her beloved trees near gone. Poor Theodora, cried the storm king's mocking song. We know how it feels to be pulled up by the roots. We know how it feels to not be able to choose. We have survived much. We've been beaten by the sky. Our story lives on. These strong seeds refuse to die. Linden is our name. We have grown back, oh so tall. Linden is our name. We stand for healing for all. It's not been easy. It's often laborious. But we Lindens are quite firm. No storm kings victorious. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that amazing reading, Cassandra. That was really good. And thank you for the introduction of the poem. That gives us a bit of background as well as to how to think about this poem and as an entryway into your writing. So I really like the Storm King, and it feels like he's a bit mocking in this poem, and the trees sing back as they die. And I wonder what made you refuse to write them as the victims, and why is it important to portray them in the way you did by the ending in a more sort of honorable way? And why is that important in this poem?
So I was thinking as I was writing the poem and some other poems through the perspective of the linden trees from that house, I was thinking a lot about the complicated history of that house and how the family that used to own the house were big slave trading people. And actually, the town of Bristol, Rhode Island, was the hub for the global slave trade. And this family basically controlled the economy of the whole town. And so I was thinking about the idea of the trees witnessing everything and being these silent witnesses, but also the trees as kind of perhaps a metaphor for people who refuse to be beaten down or controlled, or and so like the slaves who were in the house, and I think it's important to not frame people like that as victims, but as survivors. And so that was something that I was thinking about as I was writing the poem, and how the linden trees refuse to die and they refuse to be forgotten or conquered. And then in the context of today, since now 3 years have passed since I wrote this poem, I was also thinking about other kinds of kinks, shall we say, or other kinds of threats of power and things that are trying to hold all of us down collectively. And so that also gave me a new perspective in sharing the poem now.
Thank you. That was a brilliant answer. I really loved how you explained it, and there's indeed this sense of resilience by the end of the poem. It's not you know, a defeat, but rather quite the opposite, which is a great thing to empower our voices, and that nature itself, it's empowering itself instead of being defeated. So I think that's a really interesting way to look at it. Fantastic. That's good. Thank you so much. So our next poet is, well, it's someone who doesn't need much introduction, but Aileen Cassinetto. She is the 2021 Academy of American Poets Laureate Fellow and a winner of the 2025 Foley Poetry Prize. She is a co-founder of Paloma Press. She is also co-editor of Dear Human at the Edge of Time, Poems on Climate Change in the United States and the Nature of Our Times, Poems on American Lands, Water, Wildlife, and Other National Wonders. So I'm very happy to have you here today. She will be reading in Half Moon Bay.
Thank you, Erwin. I wrote this poem a few years ago. It's about Half Moon Bay, which is one of my favorite places and about 20 minutes from where I live. In Half Moon Bay, there are all these halves at the edge of the sea, like half a heart of shore, briefly cradling a sea star that has bravely lost its arms. When its stone coral mouth is already drained of sea water, its spine of honeycomb lime would be the last to go. At low tide, the feisty and starry flounder leaves tracks in pursuit of ghost shrimp, while the shy and snowy plover wades in and out of waves, not playing, but foraging for sandhoppers, its fortune tied with the tides like sand and moonshine. But count on the bread to still rise on century-old bricks 6 days a week, like goodwill or good fortune inside a wave. Thank you.
Thank you, Aileen. That was a really beautiful reading, and I think the images were very evocative. I think this poem has a lot of creatures doing the work and foraging, tracking, surviving, really. And there's this, it's completely indifferent to being witnessed by humans. There is, I feel, throughout the whole poem, this idea of having two sides. And I wonder how the witness reconciles these two sides of the poem.
Well, you're right in that it gives you perspective because all of that labor would be happening whether you're there or not. And the poem works through incompleteness. And so I wanted to write about something that's sustaining and not just about something that was lost or we are losing. For example, the bread still rises on century-old bricks. So it's hope that is enacted through daily practice, and all of it being intertwined near this shoreline that's always negotiating against between the sea and land. So it's a place that's never stable to begin with.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It's never stable and it's sort of incomplete, as you said, in like the half of a moon. Sometimes it's like a cycle as well, in which is intertwined both Earth and the ocean. Very lovely. Thank you so much for this brilliant poem. So next up we have Pat Farrington. So Pat Farrington is a poet who spent her formative years in West Africa, experiencing close encounters with scorpions, locusts, and snakes. and being balefully eyed by vultures, exiled to England for school, she went on to work as an assistant editor in educational publishing. 3 years as primary teacher, and then nearly 20 years as a director and producer for BBC School Television, where, amongst other things, she wrote song lyrics for young children. And after leaving the BBC, Pat worked for a charity, bringing writers into schools for residencies. And then, apart from taking up environmental activism, she retired to an allotment where she provided meals for pests, which she later recognized as being an essential part of most ecosystems. And she has 2 grandchildren, Rosa and Ada, which are a joy to her and allow her to revisit the natural world through a child's eyes. Thank you for being here.
Would you like me to read now from If We Could All Voice Out Loud, which is imagining that Ice Age animals could speak. Once upon a time, we were sacred, our likenesses on cave walls, drawn between 2 worlds through a membrane, magicked up in charcoal and ochre, making us all come alive by the flickering light of limestone lamps, entrancing you. But your drawings could not capture us, lords of the earth, a roaring river of sun-glinting fur, massive bison, lions, saber-toothed tigers and leopards, surging towards our hunting grounds, chasing the antelope, challenged by you, our stick-legged rivals. Then you multiplied and multiplied, cutting up our cape of forests, no longer lords of the earth, but subjects isolated on green islands. If we could all voice out loud what we think of erstwhile worshippers, we would roar, just who do you think you are?
Thank you very much, Pat, for this amazing reading. I absolutely adore this poem. I've heard you read this poem quite a few times in the book launches, and it always astounds me. It really brings the urgency and the reflection of this duality between nature and humans. And so something I'm very curious about is the fact that you chose the Ice Age for this poem instead of something contemporary or modernist or the Industrial Revolution, for example. So I was wondering why is the Ice Age important in this poem? Why is it important for it to put us in that sort of mindset?
The British Museum put on an exhibition on the Ice Age, and it became clear that actually these animals were the masters of the universe, and that the humans were in fact stick-like creatures who were weak and very vulnerable, and the animals at that time were actually half again as big as modern versions of lions and tigers, and they were magnificent. And the thinking from the curator was that people were very envious of their power and their glory and their beauty. This roaring river of the fur going up in the river valleys must have been extraordinary.
Yeah, that really makes me think of this kind of humans depicted as just sticks, and then the animal being sort of like an enemy. They were always trying to capture it or kill it or escape from it, and there was since then this kind of rift between the two humans and animals, and I think that's a really interesting kind of analogy or image that helps us look at this poem in, in different perspectives and then different through different lenses. So thank you so much for also providing us with some of the background of the British Museum exhibition. That was very interesting as well. Okay, so now we have David Hassler, and he is the Bob and Walter Wick Executive Director at Kent State University and the Wick Poetry Centre. With Poets for Science founder Jane Hirschfield and the Wick Poetry Centre have led the Poets for Science initiative since 2017. He is the author of 10 books of poetry and nonfiction and co-author of articles on poetry, technology, and healing in the Journal of Palliative Medicine, the Journal of Technology and Teacher Education, and the Online Journal of Issues in Nursing. His awards include Ohio Poet of the Year, the Ohio Honor Book Award, and the Carter G. Woodson Honor Book Award. Please welcome David Hassler, who will read his poem, Pledge, a community poem.
Thank you, Erwin. I was excited to have the opportunity to include this poem in the anthology, in part because it's actually not my words, but a community poem that I compiled and scripted, pulled together, based on pledges by scientists. As Erwin mentioned, we started Poets for Science in 2017 on Earth Day on the National Mall with Jane Hirschfield. And the March for Science organizers invited me to come a year later to the Education Summit in Chicago. And I got this idea to use a poem by Gary Snyder as a prompt to invite them in a plenary, at the end of a plenary talk, to write their own pledges. And Gary Snyder has a beautiful poem called For All, in which he says, I pledge allegiance to the soil of Turtle Island. And so this was at the start of the summit, and they all wrote. We didn't have the more sophisticated technology, digital technology then that we used for the nature of our times. And they wrote by hand their own pledges, and I collected over 100 of them and went back to my hotel room and worked over the next day and a half and scripted this large pledge, multi-voice, and then found 4 very brave volunteers to rehearse with me to then perform it at the end of the summit as a choral reading, a kind of dramatic reading. So this is Pledge, a community poem. A bright light streams through my window. I look up to thank the gift of the sun, whose energy drives our own. Tangled clouds of magnetism blasting from the golden orb. I pledge allegiance to the coastline, the meeting of earth and sea, solid and fluid, to the depths of the oceans and the life that remains undiscovered, curiosities for our wonder. I pledge allegiance to the diatoms, carbon fixers, master architects of glass in our waters, living snowflakes swirling, sweeping to infinity. I pledge allegiance to the ocean, more original than the origin of species, source of fear and awe, now suffering herself polluted. I pledge allegiance to the cradle of humanity, to all the members of our family tree who have left us clues about our past. I pledge allegiance to the spaces where we are welcome, and I pledge to challenge the status quo in the spaces where we are not. To trees tall and green, I pledge allegiance. To the call of the loon by the lake, to creeks with their bubbles and gurgles. I pledge allegiance to the starry night sky washed out by bright city lights, one galaxy in brilliance above all. I pledge allegiance to the triple helix, the interstitial glue holding ourselves together. I pledge allegiance to resilience and resistance to our blind, tenacious spirit ever adapting, to fireflies and their flickering sparks on humid summer evenings, to dragonflies and damselflies, first in flight 300 million years ago, voracious predators, insect lions, enigmatic and powerful. I pledge allegiance to the prairie, root mass vining through native soil, seed head flags waving in summer storms, to the crack of lightning and thunder, so simple, so complex and biochemical. I pledge allegiance to leaf-cutter bees carving sharp crescent voids in redbud leaves, to territorial carpenter bees hovering near fence posts, to all the hard-working hymenoptera tirelessly ferrying life across the ether. I pledge allegiance to soil, home of free-living, nitrogen-fixing bacteria and fungi, to the raw, crumbly matter holding the capacity for life. I pledge allegiance to the Gothic cathedrals of caves, their columns of dripping stalactites, the flapping wings of bats, a choir echoing through ancient corridors. I pledge allegiance to my mountain, always present in my view, a touchstone grounding me, humbling me with its scale, to the endless details of its mass, the fern frond, verdant with orange specks, the shrouded salamander, the fallen decaying log returning to earth beneath my feet. I pledge to be guardian of my habitat, my sustaining solitude, my retreat, my inspiration. I pledge allegiance to the people in this room and the potential we represent for social change, for justice, for science, in service for all.
Thank you so much, David. Sorry, I was making some notes because I wanted to run through some things very interesting in your poem. So I'm very impressed by the collectivity of this poem and, as a way of patchwork. It really reads like a sustained single piece, and through the anaphora of I Pledge Allegiance, which I think it's really interesting. I wonder, because for me, this phrase, I hear it more often than not in, for example, educational contests of, for example, at school, that you pledge allegiance to the flag, and it's kind of like a national sort of pride. So I wonder, was there anything in this poem that sort of tried to be a bit more political and like to create a bit of activism in a way of let's say bring together everyone through a hymn or a phrase that everybody knows because they grew up with it, and in a way, instead of doing it for just, let's say, a nation, do it for the whole world and for nature and for holding us together. So I don't know if there is a connection there. I wonder.
Absolutely. And I feel that implicit throughout the whole poem is this call to say that we need to reframe, realign our allegiance, not to these made and temporary political structures that can have tyrannical leaders, etc., but to the earth itself, to a larger sense of self, a larger sense of home, and that we are, we call ourselves word nerds at the Wick Poetry Center, and we often use words. They evolve over time to be used to mean something actually opposite from what they originated as. And the word individual from Latin individuare means literally indivisible from the whole. So, we use it to think that to say that we're separate from each other, separate from nature, but in fact, its origins, its root means that we are in fact deeply and inseparable to each other, and the health of the planet, determines my health. That we can't separate out that, and I think using that charged and loaded word allegiance, which we are forced. My son is graduating from high school. We went to a award ceremony, And we had to stand up and say the Pledge of Allegiance, right? Before this ceremony even began, before we had breakfast. It was a breakfast award ceremony. And I want to pledge allegiance to a larger sense of connection to our entire ecosystem. Ecos from Greek means home, right? Right. Ecology, which was actually a new word. I mean, what, the mid 1800s, a German, it was coined. We mint and coin language, and it was coined literally not even 200 years ago. But it means, Earth. Gary Snyder talks about this. Earth's household, right? Ecology, the knowledge of our home. Um, and we need a deeper knowledge of this home and reframe what we understand to be our home. It's not separate from the home of beavers and the home of prehistoric lions, larger than us. So yeah.
Yeah, that was so interesting. Thank you so much for bringing that up and all your knowledge as well on the etymology of these words, because I think we need to get to the core of them in order to rethink of our daily, the way we express ourselves daily. And when we use these words, what do they actually mean? Luisa, she put in the chat that economy, the uptake of our home, that's very, very true. And there is this collectivity as well, not just in the poem itself, but the sense of having something beyond what we think it's to stand up for each other, not just as a nation, but as a whole, as humanity, as nature, as our planet, and that we are not separate from, as you said, not separate from the earth or nature, but we're actually all in it. We're part of it. So we have to treat it as our home as well. That's really, really good and very interesting little crash course. um, awesome. So, okay, we're now going to continue with Nancy. Oh, I hope I pronounce it well. Huggett.
Huggett, that's right.
Oh, good.
That's
Okay.
right, Owen. Good job.
Amazing. Nancy Huggett is a settler descendant writing and caregiving on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe.
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Algonquin Nation, Ottawa, Canada. You can find her work in Canadian Library Review, One Art, Poetry Northwest, and Best Canadian Poetry 2026. She's won some awards like the RBC Pan Canada 2024, New Voices, and a gazillion rejections. Sorry about that. She keeps writing, though, that's really important. Her first book of poetry will be published in 2027 by University of Alberta Press. Congratulations for that. And so today she will be reading her poem called We're Doubling Down, says Darren Woods.
For those of you following along, it's on page 201 in the anthology. So we're doubling down, says Darren Woods. Not even fiddling, but feeding the fire, branch by branch, tree by ancient tree, bristle cone, panana, redwood, chestnut, black ash, white bark pine, all wisdom gone, frack by fractured frack that cracks the earth for molten cash. No time to burn 'em north, no time to heal those Permian wounds that weep and flare into the air that bathes our breath in ash. We've doubled down, restocked the pile that feeds the flames, that drive the heat, that burns the world around us while we sleep.
Thank you so much, Nancy. That was beautiful, and I think it was very powerful as well. I see that in this poem you also provided an author's note. Could you please let us know the importance of this note?
Yes, so I wrote the poem. It came rather quickly, but I follow Bill McGibbon's Substack, which is a really good source for me of environmental or sustainable energy information, and usually a good way to get news about what might be happening politically in the world and decisions that are being made. And one day I read about Darren Woods, Exxon's chief executive officer, saying, the US is really it's going to be we're not going into renewable resources. We're just going to keep drilling. So we're going to double down on everything we can do to extract from the earth. And I just had this vision right then of, this old, sorry if this is sexist, but old boys network sitting around a campfire, and the light of the campfire inflaming their faces as they're throwing on all these trees and wood, and just oblivious to the rest of the world that is sitting around in darkness until they reach back and, find that there's no wood left to burn or whatever. So yeah, that's my note.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially, since you mentioned, the breath of the trees, it provides us with oxygen as well. So in a way, we are part of this kind of transaction between nature and us. And when we burn them as well, we have also other chemicals that may alter the environment. And also, why would we do that to something that's beneficial even for us as well, right? So it doesn't make much sense. But that's a very lovely poem, and also I love the musicality of it, very well crafted.
Thank you.
Right. So next up we have Jessie Holth. Hope that's the right pronunciation.
Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. So Jessie is a nonfiction writer and poet living in, again, this place I can't pronounce,
Lekwungen, yeah.
Lekwungen territory. Her poems appear in Poetry, Prairie Schooner, Room, Arc, and other publications. As editor-in-residence at the ex-Puritan, she created the series Ecopoetics in the era of climate crisis. She recently served as a juror of the Scholastic Writing Awards and is a member of Poetry in Voice. Thank you so much for being here. Today, Jessie will be reading a poem with no trees in it, which actually links to the previous one, so pretty amazing.
It's a good order to have. Yeah, so if anyone's following along in the book, it's page 337. It's called Poem with No Trees in It, and it's after Claire Walmanholm. Instead, there is a wide field of grass. Instead, there is a wide blue sky. Instead, the hot vapor rises as steam from the pot, out of the earth and into the air. Breath hardens into ice. The black sand reaches with long fingers into the cave, wraps itself around tall hexagonal stacks of basalt, columns of stone, the steps of giants who lived on this land long before us. We spiral toward infinity. We parade down the streets of dead men who doubted the world could ever be different. When the sun appears, finally and at last, each day begins, and begins with a deep, true sound. I am still here.
Oh, thank you so much for that beautiful reading as well. It was fantastic hearing it for the first time in the poet's voice. I think this poem is fantastic at many levels, not just in the craft, because it's beautiful. It sounds really beautiful as well, kind of hypnotic sometimes. I really like, for example, at the beginning that you start with instead there is a wide field of grass. So instead of the trees, we have this grass and also the blue sky. What do you think the reader might feel, or what do you feel as a writer, having the vision of no trees at all? How does it feel for you? Because you mentioned as well the steps of giants who lived there before, and you also mentioned the dead man who doubted the world. So these elements of a sort of apocalyptic sort of world might feel a bit terrifying for some people, right? And desolate. So what do you as a writer feel when you had this image in your mind, and how did you transform it into a poem?
Yeah, good questions. So I don't know if anyone here knows the poem that it's after, which is Poem with No Children in it. That's the title. It's a wonderful poem. And so that poem is sort of what inspired this one. Which is very rare for me, but I actually had the title before I wrote the poem. So I started there, Poem with No Trees in it, and I didn't know where it was going to go. And I thought it would be, like you said, very dark, maybe apocalyptic. But I also had other things in mind too, like places where there have been no trees. Like Iceland, there's basically no trees because when people first got there 1,000 years ago, they used up all the trees, right? So there were a lot of things in my mind, sort of deep history and then like futuristic, like you said, apocalyptic. So there's all these things at play. But then as I was writing it, it sort of shifted into a place of hope, which the ending, I was sure this was going to be a very depressing poem, and it didn't turn out that way. So yeah, it actually it moves somewhere that I think is a better landing place. Like we're here, we're still here, we're all still here, and sort of gives us a path forward into action.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. Indeed, when I saw the title for the first time reading the anthology, I was like, oh gosh, I'm going to prepare myself for this one. But it actually had some incredible, there's this lightness inside of it that brings you to a brighter side. And, it does deal with difficult topics, but not in a pessimistic way, which I think is very important, to maintain the hope for a better future, for the hope that things can get better and that we can take care of each other and it's not lost yet. So
I'm glad that came through.
thank you so much for reading the poem. That was lovely. And I think it's the last one now. So the last poet to read is going to be Luisa Igloria, who is the author of Call Bearer Immigrant Writing Series Prize by Black Lawrence Press 2024. 14 other books and 4 chapbooks. She is a lead editor of Dear Human at the Edge of Time, Poems on Climate Change in the United States, 2023. Offered as a companion to the 5th National Climate Assessment, originally from Baguio City, I hope that's how I pronounce it, from the Philippines, I think. She makes her home in Norfolk, Virginia, where she is the Louis I, a Jaffe and University Professor of English and Creative Writing at Old Dominion University. She also leads workshops, for she's a member of the board of the Muse Writers Center. Luisa is the 20th Poet Laureate of the Commonwealth of Virginia 2020-2022, Emerita. During her term, the Academy of American Poets awarded her a 2021 Poet Laureate Fellowship. So today, Luisa is here with us to read her poem, Bat's French Kiss with Mouthfuls of Blood. Amazing title. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I just want to note that my poem is in the fourth section of the anthology, along with Jessie. You're also in that section, and that section is titled Now and in the Future, Bright Spots. So looking ahead. This is Bat's French Kiss with Mouthfuls of Blood. A pair tiptoe fly across the soft dark, then do a kind of running jump, landing on the cow's nape. What does it feel, or does it feel at all, or is it mostly unbothered? It only shakes its head a little, tethered as it is to the fence when they begin their blood feast. Saint Augustine wrote, "Inhabit, and you shall be inhabited. Dwell, and you shall be dwelt in." You could call it love, this investment in another, the shared appetite for what sustains life. But the bats are only being true to their nature. If they lick each other's mouths, it's precious currency rather than a kiss. Not ardor, but a social bond. It's possible to languish from a lack of love, even die of a broken heart. In many accounts, the love-struck sport a pallor akin to being drained of blood.
Thank you, Luisa. That was a very beautiful poem and very vividly read. I really loved the idea behind it and the way you bring the imagery and the metaphor of how these animals are, they're just acting according to their nature, and we can observe some amazing that this the magic of some creatures that connect in ways that we do not normally do. And for example, we might connect with each other through right now through the internet, through talking to each other through a screen. And the way these animals do this tells us something very important about their innate in the way they inhabit each other. And I think that's very beautiful when we think of blood, not in terms of gory, but in terms of um, passing our genes and ourselves sort of and sharing part of ourselves with other people as a sort of connection, like an umbilical cord, for example, and how the baby and the mother are also connected. I found very interesting as well that you mentioned the Sermon of Love um, in the part where it says St. Augustine, when he wrote, "Inhabit, and you shall be inhabited, dwell, and you shall be dwelt in." So how does that play out in well, in comparison, but more like in hindsight, if we think of humans as also creatures?
Yeah, yeah. Those are great questions. And I'm so glad you also brought up the idea of like maternal cells continuing to live in the bodies of, well, mothers and children. That's a mitochondrial connection, correct? And I love the idea you're bringing in about how the idea of inhabiting something can extend far beyond the instance or the physical, the first moment of its iteration. And actually, I didn't think about it when I wrote this poem, but later on, I got reminded of John Donne's poem, the metaphysical poet John Donne, who wrote The Flea, where a flea bites these lovers, and he makes the argument that, hey, we're connected now because our blood is in the body of the flea, so why don't you get with me? But that besides that being there, I think the idea is that there are questions that we can ask that focus beyond the fact of physical observation and take us into a place of, I think, broader connection and analysis. And certainly that's where I find the connection to the idea of symbiosis, or as the images of the bats and the cows in the poem, I hope, demonstrate, they're cool. They live with each other. What's a little prick on the nape? I mean, I sustain you, you sustain me, it's all good. So I guess it also reminds me about the purpose of language being to help us embody the things that are difficult to embody. Language being a kind of way to take us back to the moment. And I know that we can't quite replicate the actual moment in language, but our task, I think, as poets, which is similar to the task of scientists, is to try to bring us as close as possible to the experience as we could come. And so that's the way we can engender feelings for one another, of sympathy, of compassion, of connection. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, it makes complete sense. It's very nice to hear you talk about the symbiosis of this, of the way we perceive our interactions, our daily interactions with each other, and the way we use language as well. There's this kind of urgency I feel in this poem of continuation, of trying to belong. You're part of me, I'm part of you, and we're going to transcend, we're going to carry on as poems themselves. I think if you make this point as well, the fact that poems will transcend and outlive us and will be part of other people's lives as well, and connect us in ways that these bats are connecting. So I think that's a very good way to see it as well. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
And well, I think that's all the readings for tonight. And oh, well, my poem as well. I'm going to pull it up. I also have a poem in this anthology, and I wanted to write about an endangered creature that's in California called the dog-faced butterfly, because I found it really beautiful and interesting. It has it's yellow and it has two black dots on each of its wings, which resemble eyes as well. I have no idea why they called it dog-faced butterfly. I have no, but anyways, here it is. Ode to the California dog-faced butterfly. February's breath frayed at the edges, with orange streaks lost in prairie gold. The dog-face breathes in the breeze of fevered suns of summer meadows. Its yellow wings crackle like hot paper, stitched into this earth by sunburnt hands, and a black dot tattooed in its back. Oh, the nectar thief! Oh, flame-winged thing, tracing the belly of America like a knot, with golden threads of riverbeds. Dog-face, dog-face, dog-face. A name too simple for this burning thing, with its fluttering, flying, flaming face. Dog-face, chihuahua face, shepherd face, poodle face. Little matters what we call this creature, as long as it's wild and unchained. Once you mistook its flight for freedom, but no, this one has very thin flesh, bound to its sticking tiny bones. In August, it quivers like a compass needle, chasing the blue bruised sky full of riddles. Not a pilgrim seeking the secret shores of the west coast, but a vagabond lost forevermore. Where do you flee to, weightless dog-face? You cannot outrun the knot that smolders your body to the southern sun. The city, where still rivers clot the veins of man, where asphalt scorches the tongue. In the city, they talk of butterflies as paper dolls, stains on window panes, the loss of beauty. They know nothing of wings, only dollar bills. But have they seen a real dog face ever? No. When a butterfly takes a shortcut through the city, it crumples and dies. You rise, pilgrim of dead rivers drunk on pollen, coasting the brittle jaws of fences, where the city's teeth chew the throat of nature. You stand, not like city steel, not like cabled bridges, not like clouds of smog, but like the echo of thunder, the distant roar of Patterson's Falls, rolling across the deserts and plains, rippling up to the river of Schutemul Bear. Yet this dog face knows him not like the butterflies that do not fear being settled on the false stone ear. It never liked those waterfalls, always running, never stopping. The water flows, the water falls, and falls, and falls, and falls. And the dog face falls too, onto its wings, where you can see the nation's map unfolding wide, cracked, and damp, like a paper frail atlas, returning to the earth, to the place where life breaks and a new one awakes. Thank you. Now we're going to move on to the next section, which is our last section, which is a conversation. We're going to have a little talk and open questions as well. So feel free to write your questions in the chat as well, if you're willing to, or open the mic when, raise your hand and then I will give you, yield the floor. So first I'm going to ask a few questions and anybody can come up and answer them if they feel like they have something they would like to say about it. So the first question is, what does it mean to write nature in a damaged world? So maybe I can start just to break the ice. So actually, I think poetry is one of the best allies of nature. It always tries to convey nature in different ways, but there has been definitely a shift during the Industrial Revolution where I think it has taken a turn to nature as something that we start to grieve, something that we start to mourn because we fear that it will be lost. Which before, I mean, in some cases it was, there were fires and there were tsunamis and natural disasters as well, which were part of poems that were written hundreds and hundreds of years ago. But I think that nowadays it has become more and more common to see poems that deal with the despair and the hopes that we will do something about nature. And in a way, I feel this kind of shift going from admiring nature to we must admire it, if that makes sense. It's not just observation now, but it's looking at why is it so important to us? Because I think before it was a given that nature was part of us. But since we started to drift and have these big cities and big clash between nature and urban and rural and human and nature, I think we started to try to reconnect nature with nature in a way that we did not see as a problem before. So this is just an idea, but I think that's why we need to keep on writing nature. So I see Jesse has something to say. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I was just thinking something that it means, I think, to write nature today is decentering the human perspective. So I just wanted to mention that. And I think a lot of us are doing that here. But just to go off of what you said, yeah, sort of decentering that perspective and shifting it. And then as I was thinking that, I kind of realized in the poem that I read today, I'm not actually even sure who the speaker is. They might not be human, right? It's not actually clear. You know, it could be someone not human, right? So I just wanted to add that, my 2 cents there.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. And just before I give the word to Pat, because I think that's also something that she does in her poem, how we give voice to these ice creatures. And why is it important for us to try to imagine what nature is telling us, how to transcribe in a way what nature is begging us to do, and how would we interact with nature through poetry. And Pat Farrington does this really well in her poem. So I'm going to yield the floor to Pat.
Thank you. I just wanted to say in poetry now, I think we have to consider the damage we have done as we have become the apex predator. The Ice Age animals were in the past the apex predators, and now we are. And we need to raise consciousness about the eco crisis. Here in the UK, 90% of nightingales have now disappeared, and they were the fodder for all the poets in the past. Everybody who was anybody wrote about nightingales. And in my poem, I say at the end, please don't tell me nightingales will just be found in odes.
Yeah, that's the record of the animals that have been lost. How we can, I don't think we could imagine what they looked like unless we had archaeologists and scientists digging and finding the pictures of cavemen. All of these collective investigations that allows us, that serve as a record in the same way that poems serve as records of what has been and what can be. And in a way, I think your poem, what it does really well is, as you say, I don't want the nightingales just to be in poems. Like I want them to carry on, and I want to be able to not just imagine through this poem what they looked like, but I want to actually see them. All right. So next we're going to go to the next question, which is, if do you feel, as a writer, do you feel pressure to be accurate or to be emotionally true? Yeah, Luisa?
Making sure the mic is on. I don't think that those terms need to necessarily be mutually exclusive. And oftentimes, the greater the specificity and the accuracy of our descriptions, our language, or what we embody in words or in our art, there is more of the possibility of getting away from those dangerous abstractions and coming closer to rendering the emotional truth of an experience or an instance. So I don't think that it's a binary, in other words.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, it really is a sort of, yeah, there is no binary in terms of being hopeful or not being hopeful. It's more like a spectrum, I would say. And even so, we can approach it through so many different ways in our writing. So yeah, it's a really good point. Anyone else? Yeah, Nancy?
Oh, sorry.
I think also each poem or experience, like there are poems that I write that are very dark, and there are poems that I write, like if you're looking at the binary, very hopeful, and there are poems that I write that carry both in them. And that comes so much for me from being present to the specifics of a place, like where I am right now, even where I am right now, if I walk to one part of the river, I may notice certain beings, creatures, interactions going on. And if I follow the river all the way down to the other end of the river, where the affluence is, and a whole other relationship ensues. And so for me, it's more about being present and learning and sharing that presence in a way that might make other people in some ways curious about how we define community. Does that make sense? Like the community where I live and interact and what upholds me is not just my neighbors in their brick houses, but, and for me, I'm stuck in many ways where I'm intrigued by that whole idea of like constraint, the constraint of place, and how you can show people that nature is not something you necessarily have to travel far to interact with, that that in the mundane there is both hope and sadness at what we are losing, but also what we can love. And without noticing, then that won't, neither of those emotions will occur.
Right. Yeah, that's very true. And we can hold those emotions, both negative and positive, at the same time.
I'd like to
Next.
add, if I
Oh,
can jump in, that also poets, one of the tools of poetry is hyperbole, right? Hyperbole is a form of metaphor. And so I think both the emotional truth of what's going on and research in poetry, but also we can imagine what the future might look like. And I think it's really important for us to write that and to be witnesses to what's going on. We can't necessarily, through a poem, enact policy changes, but we're trying, right? But we can imagine the worst things and we can allow the poem to, and I think not fear going into the dark and not fear that because it's all around us as well. So that was my little, I wanted to jump in with that. And I think Cassandra wants to jump in too.
yeah, absolutely. Please.
Thank you. Yeah, I think also for me, even if I have a poem that is dealing with some difficult things or sad things regarding nature and collapse and things like that, so far, I've always made a conscious choice to have a hopeful ending, and that's just for myself, so I don't feel as if I'm succumbing to this feeling. Though there is certainly, like, there can be space and it can be appropriate to paint pictures of both kinds of worlds. But that helps me kind of write the next poem after that to not feel like, oh no, what do I do now? And just touching on what Erwin had said before about grieving now when we look at nature and how that has kind of changed the literary mindset of it. Like I think in the past it would have been more common to write a poem about like an ode to a tree or the springtime or a bird or something. And there are still places for those and we can still write those, but there's so much more at stake now that it feels like just writing about nature can be an act of hope and an act of witness and even rebellion to what's happening. And I think that's why books like The Nature of Our Times are so important because they can spread that awareness and connection that might reach people more than just the statistics. And I know that's the whole point of these books is to bridge that human kind of empathy for these things that are happening to make people care. So I just think that that is it's really hopeful and inspiring. And so I'm glad to be a part of that with everyone.
Brilliant. I love that because it really is true that we need um, to really bring ourselves back to this more empathetic view of nature, which has been lost because we are now very trapped in this kind of urban spaces, and we interact very little with nature now, I feel. And so I think this kind of having in the background, having in our heads the knowledge, the awareness that things are going bad, we hear everywhere, um, climate change, the temperature is rising, and there's, all of these disasters happening, and the pollution, and we have all of these ideas in our head which were not very prevalent a few centuries ago. And so I think it's very hard to detach those ones when we write poems about nature. It kind of tarnish a little bit um, our narratives, and that's why I think this question of hope comes into place. But yeah, thank you so much. That was a great answer. And to go back a little bit on the activism, because I think Yvonne talked a little bit about it. So the next question is, in what ways can poetry enact change? How can we embody the truths of poetry? As we talked about it already, it's not a policy making. Doing poetry is not an actual making of law, but I would be very interested to know what you have to say about the ways we can act and upon these issues. So first, Jessie.
Yeah, thank you. I wasn't sure to jump in whether on what Yvonne was saying, but in terms of poetry is not policy. But I in the series that I did a few years ago, which brought together writers across Canada who were talking about ecopoetics, the one thing that we all agreed on was that poetry is not enough. And so it's like the beginning of the conversation. It opens the door, but it always has to be coupled with concrete action. So whether that's, signing petitions or writing to your legislators or marching, climate march or protests or whatever actions you take, they always have to go hand in hand. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that's very important. Yep. Luisa?
Yeah, the question of agency or activism, I think that we tend to associate those terms with very hyper-visible acts of, say, resistance, like protest actions, demonstrations, boycotts, and so forth. But I think activism at heart is, that idea of agency or finding out what we can do. And I feel too that there are more quiet forms of activism that are no less than those that require going out in this sort of hyper visible way. For instance, I like to think of kindness as one of those forms of shaping and exercising agency that might not always get centered in conversations about activism, but it's really a very basic thing.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think also there's a very important, it's also like the author has, in a way, some power to empower other people and to change the people around its community. I think our readers are, are the first. This is the way we spread the word. This is the way we spread and change consciousness. So, yes, Alex.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, everyone, for your lovely readings and the conversation. I thought I'd just jump in as a lurking non-poet. So I'm actually a political theorist by training, or I'm a PhD student studying political theory. And I just thought given the conversation was kind of leading more into my wheelhouse, I thought I'd jump in and sort of think about, I think a lot of the things you're saying chimes very well with sort of my experience of teaching the climate crisis in a way that can bring about hope in students. And one of the most successful kind of sessions I've held are ones that look at the climate crisis through ecological fiction or science fiction, and also eco-poetry. And what it always brings me back to is that cliche term, or that cliche the phrase of it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is of capitalism. And I don't really like the phrase because it's often a thought terminating phrase among students, at least I find that they just go, well, it's too difficult to imagine a different world. So why should I bother, right? I should just get on and try and, do the best I can in the current system. But what I think, particularly what you guys do with your poetry, what fiction writers do with their fiction, and much better than political theorists and political scientists, is you actually provide different ways of thinking about the world and imagining the future in particular. And so it's true that maybe it doesn't go into the nitty gritty of policy. But to be honest, we have a lot of policy think tanks and policy wonks out there. They don't seem to have changed the trajectory of civilization, right? And it's because at least what I work on is I do think that actually one of the most political things people can do is imagine, right? The imagination is actually an intentionally political part of our experience in the world and allows us to operate politically. And so what I've really enjoyed just sitting and listening to you is how it refreshes my imagination for that when I go in to do my political work, I can have that more kind of ecologically deep sense of the world in mind. So again, sorry, I don't have much to say on the nitty gritty of the poetry, but I just thought I would come in to kind of give a different perspective.
No, I think that's brilliant. And that makes me think as well, there's many times in which I always wonder what would happen if people in power and politicians would read poetry. I think we would live in a completely different world. And this kind of talks about how we make policy sometimes is a very specific area in our system, in our societies, that do not always combine with humanities, for example, which is pivotal for understanding society. And we have to try to make awareness for all those people who are also doing politics and who also hold power to interact with the arts as well. And I think in a way when an assessment like this one that put the nature of our times comes to the world, it is a beacon saying, here we are, this is our project, and you get attention not just from poets, but also from scientists and also from other areas, which, it really expands the breadth of outreach that these ideas have. So I think that's a really good food for thought, the fact of, how do we make policy? Aileen also wanted to add something.
I think you and Alexander talked about what I wanted to bring up, but also I wanted to add, I always try to go back to relationships, what we choose to protect, what we ignore, how we vote. Poetry, which is why when we were doing both anthologies, Dear Human and The Nature of Our Times, we were adamant that poetry wouldn't just be a way to communicate science, but that alongside the language of and methodology of science, we were presenting the language of poets. So and you're right, we don't do policy, but then we are able to influence the conditions under which policies are made, which is what I'm witnessing where I am right now in the San Francisco Bay Area. So I also want to say, which is why I really appreciate our contributors, because the way that they send us the way that you send us your poems, the poems are never vague. And so whenever I read the poems, my perspective keeps changing. And so I think that helps deepen my sense of responsibility.
Yeah, I think the agency that we have towards these issues have a very big, kind of derive a lot from the things we read, the things we experience every day. And as you said, projects like these are incredibly important because it really each poem has a different perspective, and you go through them through each of these angles, and it broadens your horizons in ways that you've never thought it could. So that's very important. Thank you for that as well. Pat, do you have anything?
Yes. Well, I just wanted to quote Shelley saying that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world, and we need another Shelley.
We do. And in a way, I think every single one of you in this chat has something of that as well. And that's what you're doing in this, in this chat, in this anthology, and in the work you do as a poet. You are all being part of this change, and we're all trying to do this change together. And I find it really heartening and beautiful. And I'm deeply touched by how we're able across different places, like I'm in Paris, some of you are in the States, some of you are in the UK, and how we all collectively have this willingness to preserve a world so with our words, and that is very, very valuable. So thank you, Pat, for sharing that as well. And I think that also brings me to another question, which is the last one. How does the place where you live at the moment, or the country that you live, influence your writing about climate crisis and in the human world? So in a way, how does your experiences of living in a specific place, according to your unique experience, how does that influence your writing of nature? Luisa, yes.
Yeah, in relation to that question, I think for me, being an immigrant and a woman of color from a nation that was at least twice colonized, including by the United States, where I now live and teach at a university, has definitely shaped my attitudes towards nature and the realities of climate change. My husband and their family are from Chicago, but also originally from the Philippines. And so my ties to Chicago are both familial and relational in that way, but I also think of Chicago in terms of my relationship to where I come from in the Philippines, or where I grew up, which is Baguio City, which was created as a hill station by the American colonial government in the 1900s. And so I always feel this back and forth, this oscillation between nostalgia and memory, and then the reality of my present moment, and thinking about how the world, the place that first formed me, is no longer, it bears no resemblance at all to the world that I knew before, and even more so today. So with the idea of nostalgia and turning to the past and memory, there's also the realization that we could slip into an easy romanticization of the past. But I also know that that's not always a healthy thing to, sustain, or impossible to sustain, rather. It is more difficult, but not impossible, I think, to ask questions about these connections that we already bear to the past might help us navigate the present moment in order to get to that future which we hope for. So for me, it's like I can never forget what these connections are. And they're sort of like always there, omnipresent, like a palimpsest. The landscape that I see here is, there's always that other landscape underneath, and it'll always be there.
That's really interesting, and it's very true. Sometimes when I write a poem about nature, and I, for example, want to write about Mexico, I haven't lived there in many years, so the landscape has changed a lot. And the way I depict it in my poems is normally the way I remember it. And you have this kind of nostalgia as well. When I remember going somewhere, for example, and enjoying my connection with nature, but it's this memory, this link with nature that I hold dear, and it's sort of ingrained in me. And that's the one I portray in the poem. And, sometimes you don't have to be necessarily truth to your memories. You can change it, and you can write about so many different other places, even if you haven't been there, or get inspiration from pictures as well of nature. But I think there is this sort of experience lift that that allows you to revisit your memories, to revisit the landscape and realize that it's not the same, and trying to keep this memory alive through the poem, so that, you know, because you fear that it will change in the future, that it will no longer exist. Some parks are being refurbished and now become buildings, and some streets are cut down. The cities keep expanding. So there are many places where, as Pat said, it's now only in poetry that they are alive, and that shouldn't be the case. Jesse?
Yeah, just to sort of go off of what you're saying in terms of, so I've lived where I live now for 15 years, and the ocean is here. So that comes through a lot in my poetry now. But I think I would be a different writer if I lived somewhere else for the last 15 years, right? I don't think the ocean would be as present as a body of water in my poems. And also just to what you say about the images that we have access to in when we're writing poetry, it's like what we're surrounded by in the everyday is so easy for us to access. And then when you go back in your memory trying to think of somewhere, you know, I used to live here, and you're trying to sort of create a poem based on that, like you said, there's all these layers of like memory and sort of nostalgia, and it's different. Like if you go there now, it's probably totally different, but it's sort of excavating through that to write a poem instead of sort of the tactile, you know, what we have in the everyday. And then I also just wanted to touch on something that I've been thinking about lately in terms of like reciprocity of place, just the idea that you know, we give to it and it gives to us, and you know, it can sustain us, and just sort of that idea of reciprocity. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that rings a lot of truth when we think about, you know, even if when we use metaphors, when we use hyperboles, for example, it's a way for us to reimagine something that perhaps we lost, something that perhaps we would like to imagine the futures, reshape the present, and perhaps even change the past, even if the past people say it's fixed and you cannot change it. Well, in poetry, you can. I think I would argue that the past is only seen through a single perspective in textbooks, and that is not true. I think poetry can be reimagined over and over and over. And I think poetry can help us come to terms with that idea. And yeah, it's true. When we live in different places, sometimes our inspiration changes. You live by the ocean, so now you feel a bit more connected to water, the waves, the sea, the shore. And yeah, I think that way we can get to know all the places as well and other experiences. I have never lived by the sea, so when I read a poem by the sea, I can imagine it and I can connect with it. There's this connection through imagination that I really like, and makes me not want, you know, the sea to be polluted, not wanting it to be different or green. You know, lakes and rivers now becoming brown and polluted, and so it's no longer this beautiful thing that we used to depict in poems, this very idyllic, beautiful landscape of trees and grass. Now there's a building in the middle, and and there's roads everywhere. So I think that's a very interesting thing to think about as well. Does anyone have anything else to say about this?
Oh, I was just going to say that, yeah, I think when you move into different places and consider different landscapes, it, for me, forces me to learn more about the history of that new place because I'm not as familiar with it. And that's happened because I'm from California, so the nature poetry that I wrote there was more about my own experience in California. But then coming to Rhode Island and like writing about the linden trees and wanting to know exactly the history of that area to inform my work, and then going to Ireland where I studied for about 8 months and I wrote poetry about the nature there, and I found myself learning a lot about the history of deforestation and colonization and extinction of various animals and plants, such as wolves. And that was also a very special learning experience for me, but I was really able to write my poems after learning that information about the land. And I also felt that the reception to my poetry there was was a little different than in America, which was interesting. I feel like in my experience in America, we have to kind of fight to be heard or to be taken seriously as writers and poets. And in Ireland, I felt that it was very much baked into the culture. And I took a history class about ancient Ireland. And in that class, I learned that poets were actually, they held noble status in the society. And I was like, oh, this is why. And one of the reasons for that was because they were uh, capable of satire. And one of the worst things that could happen to anyone was being a victim of satire. And so they had that kind of power over people in that way. And so I think that that's interesting now that I could take that with me because even if the social kind of um, like ideas towards poets might be different in this um, in this time and also in this country, we still have the power to have some kind of social critique or something that can make a change and influence people still.
Yeah, absolutely. We still have the power, and I think that's why it's important for us to keep on writing. And it's interesting to hear how poetry has changed for you when you moved places and how you are also perceived as a creator in these different environments. It's very inspiring to hear all of you tonight. And well, this is the end of the evening, but I really hope that you all, you know, learned or felt or had something good to think about after this event, and hopefully will nourish your creativity as well for future work. And keep on spreading the word about The Nature of Our Times by Paloma Press. It was a real pleasure to see you all and hear your poems. I think they all are exceptional. They have a different they all have something different to say. That's very important. So yeah, I just want to say thank you very much also to the ones that came and just for listening. And I will upload this video later on YouTube as well, so that everybody can see it. So thank you so much, everyone. On behalf of the Poetry Lighthouse and everyone who made this event possible, thank you very much. And I hope you have a lovely night, and I hope you are able to reconnect with nature soon. Yeah, don't forget to keep writing about nature and share it with the world.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Erwin.
I've learned something.
Erwin.
Erwin. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Good luck, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.